Good evening, everybody, and welcome to WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. It's great to have you joining with me online tonight. Last week, I shared with you a conversation that we had with my friend, good friend and fellow pastor Jerry Lang from Northport Evangelical Covenant Church in Northport, Michigan, way up above the 45th parallel. We had a great time fellowshipping in a live stream format last week, and I hope you were blessed by it. I know we were. It was great to try that. I hope we get to do that again. And there might be some other things we could try sometime. I was checking to see if you could get a Skype call to come through onto the software that I have for this broadcast, and it turns out that there must be a way to do it. So don't know too much about Skype. I haven't done much of that myself. Done some Zoom stuff. But anyhow, we'll look into that. There might be ways to connect with Jerry again, long distance, or maybe somebody else or whatever. So we'll see what happens as we move ahead. Let's get started tonight. We're getting back into the subject of origins, as you saw on the screen. And in our study from 2 weeks ago, on October the 27th, I began to show you a biblically based model for Earth's history, which I believe offers a better explanation for the Earth's features that we see today than does that uniformitarian evolutionary notion of how it took millions of years to form the rock layers and the other geologic features of our planet. We're talking there about unobservable historical events, things that can't be seen or never could be seen. Science cannot directly examine these things and therefore cannot conclusively explain what it cannot directly observe. That steps outside of the realm of the classic scientific method that we all learned in science class in school. Or at least we reviewed it. I don't know if everybody learned it or not, but we reviewed it. Therefore, all ideas, all notions that we ever hear about the origins of things, the history of the planet and that sort of thing, whether it comes from creationist or from evolutionist. All of it are speculations based on assumptions or beliefs that can't be proven. You see, this entire debate centers on whether one believes everything got here through slow, gradual processes, or one otherwise believes that much of the geologic features we see today are the result of a major globally catastrophic universal flood event. And of course, that's where I'm at. 2 weeks ago, we began studying one man's idea of how this global flood got started. Now, this is just one man's idea or theory, and there are different ones within creationism, so we can't say with any authority that what we're talking about tonight is exactly the way that it happened. And no one is saying that, not even Walt Brown, the man who devised what he calls the Hydroplate Theory. So tonight I begin with a hopefully quick yet sufficient review of what we studied 2 weeks ago. It's been 2 weeks, and I was just starting to introduce the idea at that time. And so I think you're going to need this review to remind you of the foundations of the Hydroplate Theory for everything that we're going to look at from here, even later tonight, and on into the future, however many weeks it takes us to get through this. But I think it's a worthwhile project, or I wouldn't be doing it. Consider once again with me how the pre-flood Earth may have looked. Like all the land mass was one large supercontinent with pools of water within there, but everything, all the land was connected. From Genesis 1, 9, and 10, we read, "Then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas." And that's, of course, the blue regions you see there, inland seas or whatever you want to call it there. And God saw everything that it was good. So everything was good. The Hydroplate Theory says that mountains of that time were not as high as today. Maybe they were 9,000 feet maximum. There likely were some small seas. In fact, I believe that's really what we're seeing there. The Bible tells us there were seas. It also tells us there were pre-flood rivers in Genesis 2:10. Now, a river went out from Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 riverheads. So if there were rivers heading into the seas, undoubtedly there were streams that were feeding the rivers, and so on and so forth. Slicing a quarter of the earth away, we can see inside the earth, and the granite crust is visible as a kind of white area right underneath the surface of our planet, kind of in that crest-shaped arc, almost like a rainbow shape there, part of the cutaway from the planet. So let's zoom in on that, take a closer look at that white area. The darker shaded gray area right below that whiter, lighter colored granite crust, that dark gray is the Earth's mantle. The mantle is made up of basalt. And basalt is an igneous rock. It formed from molten rock that cooled and crystallized. Just how fast did it cool? That's the interesting part of that question. The lighter gray area is the granite crust. Okay? 2 weeks ago, I shared with you some of Dr. Brown's evidence showing that the Earth's surface was never in a molten state. The atheistic viewpoint has to explain everything by chance random processes, okay? Things got together by chance, things exploded by chance, whatever with the Big Bang, and things formed by chance, and somewhere there were laws of gravity and other basic physics laws that came together to draw things together and form them in some way hitherto unexplainable because it can't be observed, we don't know what happened, and so forth. And so they've concocted the notion in all of this that the Earth's surface was molten rock for millions of years, a liquid form of rock because of the great heat on this newly formed planet or whatever. And for millions of years it stayed hot until it all cooled off. It rained on the Earth for millions of years is the idea, eventually cooling that rock. Anyhow, Dr. Brown writes this: had the Earth ever been molten, denser materials would have sunk toward the Earth's center, and lighter materials would have floated to the surface of this molten rock, okay? One should not find dense, fairly non-reactive metals, such as gold, at the Earth's surface. We shouldn't have gold mines, okay? But we do, and that's up near the Earth's surface. Yeah, you have to go down a little bit, but relatively speaking, we're not that far down. He goes on to say, even granite, the basic continental rock, is a mixture of many minerals with varying densities. And it's mixed up, it's homogenized kind of thing. If melted granite slowly cooled, which is the theory, that's what the theory says, a layer cake of vertically sorted minerals would form instead of granite. So Earth's crust was never molten. See, with that granite crust, that's one of the important things about it. It's kind of a mystery. Earth's crust could never have been molten. If it had been, we'd be seeing something completely different in the crust than that granite that we find today. So we just sort of take it for granted, right? All right. Anyway, the granite in that crust, it lies right below the surface of the Earth, this granite. You see, the original Earth, being molten for billions of years or whatever, that whole idea cannot explain the formation of granite. If such a hot liquid crust was slowly cooling down over billions of years or millions of years or whatever, the force of gravity acting on the crust's liquid molten state would have caused the material in the crust to sort out in layers, with the greater density material sinking down to the bottom, and the lesser dense material layering on up to the top. From heavier to lighter all the way up, not much different than our atmosphere is. That is the layer cake effect that Dr. Brown was writing about. As he said, the granite that we do see in the crust is a mixture of many minerals with varying densities. The crust was therefore never in a molten state. You know, it had to have hardened quickly. If it was molten, it had to have hardened in a very fast rate because you have dense material, dense minerals all throughout. It's a homogenized kind of material. Looking at this slide here on the surface, you can see that small blue sea just to the right of center where that yellow arrow is pointing. If you look where the red arrow is pointing, you'll see a thin blue line between the granite crust and the darker basalt mantle. To get a better idea of what that blue line represents, let's look a little closer. Okay, there's the blue lake on the surface, and you can see some green mountains dotting the land surface. Not high, no more than about 9,000 feet, as Dr. Brown suggests. Remember, these diagrams are representations of the pre-flood earth. We have this cross-cutaway kind of look here, appearing much as they would have when God created the earth. And you can see the blue sky of the Earth's atmosphere in this diagram as well. Now we'll focus on what looked like a blue line from farther away. This particular feature is the one and only assumption that Dr. Walt Brown makes with his theory. For everything else in his theory to work, Dr. Brown assumes that when God created the earth, he put water under the crust of the earth, that granite crust, in a series of interconnected pockets or chambers, which the arrows are pointing to in that diagram. Now, this can't be proven conclusively from the Bible, but there is a potential textual support for the idea. Let's take a look at the word firmament here, as it's used in Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. Now you can see the word firmament is used here 5 times. Okay? Here is what Dr. Brown wrote about this word as it was used in verses 6 through 8 here. And I want you to notice the note at the bottom. The Hebrew word translated as firmament here in the New King James Version is translated as expanse in the New American Standard Bible, in the Amplified Bible, in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and also in the English Standard Version. So expanse is there. So he talks about that here as he begins his note. Expanse or firmament, rakia. The key Hebrew word in Genesis 1, 6 through 8a is rakia. It is translated firmament in the King James Version and expanse in most Hebrew dictionaries and modern translations. While its original meaning is uncertain, its root, and Hebrew words have roots which are very important in determining what a word means. Its root, raka, means to spread out. That's the verb form. Rakia, of course, is a noun, right? Firmament. But raka means to spread out, to beat out or hammer as one would a malleable metal. It can also mean plate. This may explain why the Greek Septuagint, an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, translated rakia 16 out of 17 times with the Greek word stereoma, which means a firm or solid structure. The Latin Vulgate in AD 382 then used the Latin term firmamentum, which also denotes solidness and firmness. So, the King James translators in AD 1611 coined the term firmament. Today, firmament is usually used poetically to mean sky or atmosphere or heavens. In modern Hebrew, rakia means sky or heavens. However, originally, it probably meant something solid or firm that was spread out. So the original meaning of the Hebrew word rakia meant a solid, firm object that was spread out. When you think about it, that Latin word firmamentum sounds, well, kind of firm, solid. Doesn't have any airy or atmosphere-like quality to it. And the root word raka means to spread out. And I think of a blacksmith working at an anvil with his hammer as he flattens out a heated metal blade. He is raka, the verb, raka, the metal. He's spreading out the metal. So rakia is a solid expanse, a solid material that has been spread out. Now, thinking of something solid being spread out, let's take a look again at verses 6 and 7 in Genesis 1. And I'm going to substitute the words spread out solid object for the word firmament here. And you can see the Oreo cookie there in the background as an illustration. Then God said, "Let there be a spread out solid object in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the spread out solid object, and divided the waters which were under the spread out solid object from the waters which were above the spread out solid object, and it was so. So like an Oreo cookie, the waters above and the waters below are like the two chocolate cookies there, and the rakia, or spread out solid object, is like the cream filling in between them. And Dr. Brown believes that the rakia, or the firmament, in verses 6 through 8 corresponds to the earth's crust, including earth's surface features and, of course, that granite crust. There is water above the granite crust, in the atmosphere above, and also in the small seas on the surface, and in those subterranean chambers there's also water beneath the earth's surface and crust. The firmament divides the waters from the waters. All of this, plus other points that could be made, demonstrates that the word firmament, or in some versions expanse, as I have there on that granite crust for you, in Genesis 1, 6 to 8, could indeed refer to the granite crust of the earth, including the surface features of the land spread out throughout the supercontinent and beneath the seas that God originally created on the earth, as it would be with the very sea floor, of course. The water above the firmament would therefore be the hydrological cycle, including the surface water, that mist that would rise from the ground back in those days, the seas that are there, the lakes, rivers, streams, etc. And the water beneath the firmament would be found in the network of interconnected subterranean chambers that proposed by Dr. Walt Brown. Thus, the firmament would divide the waters above from the waters beneath. And this understanding makes Psalm 33 verses 6 and 7 a very intriguing read. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. All the fountains of the great deep broke open. And there's the word deep. He lays up the deep in storehouses. Note that this passage deals with the original creation of things. The deep laid up in storehouses. That could very well be those subterranean water chambers. In Genesis 7:11, we'll later read about how the fountains of the great deep burst open through the crust all on a single day. Psalm 24 verses 1 and 2 say, "The earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein." So we're talking about the crust, okay? That's where they dwell. "For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." God has founded the earth upon the seas. Underground seas beneath the earth. He's established the earth upon the waters. Underground water chambers, maybe? Perhaps this is what this inspired word of God is referring to here. Psalm 136 verses 5 and 6 reference Genesis 1:1, and verse 6 of Psalm 136 says this, "To him who laid out the earth above the waters, for his mercy endures forever." Notice this, God laid out the earth above the waters. Now, when I saw that verb laid out being associated with the earth, that solid object spread out, okay, I got really curious. So I looked up the Hebrew word, and guess what? It is indeed the word raka, the root word for rakia, the firmament. The same word we talked about in Genesis 1, 6 through 8. The word for earth here is eretz, meaning the earth. And like a cosmic blacksmith, God hammered out the surface of the earth above the waters, it says in verse 6 here. God originally put the waters, note the plural waters, like water chambers, different chambers of water, beneath the earth. Interesting. Genesis 1:6-7 tells us the original design of the earth with this firmament between the upper and lower waters. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, let it divide the waters from the waters. And so God made the firmament, divided the waters under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. Waters is plural. You have seas above, plural. You have chambers of water below, also plural. Here is what that could have looked like from the understanding of the hydroplate theory as he put this together. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters, the original creation. The surface of the globe was originally covered with water. There really was water all above and water all underneath. Note the blue circle on the surface of the planet there. Recall the Spirit hovered over the face of the waters. The earth was, in the very beginning, covered with water. From day 2, verses 6 and 7 tell us that the firmament separated the waters above from the waters below. And in the diagram, we see the earth doing just that, all over the planet. The liquid waters, the Hebrew word used, mayim, can only be used as liquid water, not ice or snow or vapor or anything like that. The liquid waters were divided in half, with half the water now being under the firmament. That solid granite structure made just for this purpose. Then on day 3, God raised up the supercontinent. You see, the water underneath is like one great big global ocean, okay, as well as the water on top, okay? So now we get to verses 9 and 10 here, which we saw I talked about earlier. Here they are. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. So this firmament is going to poke up through the water, okay? And God saw that it was good. Now the firmament was deliberately deformed, as we can see in this image here, this cross section. Denser portions of the firmament were settled down onto the underlying basalt mantle, while lighter portions rose up above the water level to become the supercontinent, the earth, and it was all interconnected. The water on the surface filled in the newly formed depressions that happened as a result of that, and that's the seas. And what happens is this pinches off the water underneath, and it's what creates all these chambers of water. We can see that Psalm 75:3 talks about the pillars of the earth. The pillars being those weighty depressions of the firmament, okay? Psalm 33:7 is repeated here for us, describing the subterranean water as the deep. And it's now being kept in storehouses, the chambers that are made by those pillars that now exist. By the way, take special note, only a little bit of the weight of the firmament or the crust was being supported by those pillars. Most of the crust's weight was supported by that pressurized water in those chambers. Think about how highly pressurized that water must have been, with all of that land mass pushing down upon it, just coming down and trapping it there, and it creates a cushion resistance, kind of an equilibrium of sorts, and it's supporting the weight. All these little pockets all over the place. Okay, kind of some of those things they try to sell you in those comfortable mattresses you get or whatever. The surface of the planet would now look something like this. One massive continent of land which would be dotted by the surface seas, which formed in those surface depressions where the pillars now were, like low areas where the puddles would form, okay? So that's why I put the little girl splashing there. Everywhere you see a blue sea here, well, that is where there is the top of a pillar that's forming that particular sea's bed. So we can just imagine sunk down lower areas that are dropping down onto the water underneath. So that's where things were at the end of the creation on day 6, at least as far as the water and land situation. Obviously, there were plant and animal life, the sun, the moon, the stars, human life as well. And then using the genealogy found in chapter 5 of Genesis, we figured there was around 1,600 years from the creation of Adam until the time of the flood. I have the flood event circled there with a red oval so you can quickly see it. The exact number of years, when you do the math, found in the genealogy, and the ages of the men are listed on there in Genesis chapter 5, which is where those names come from Adam and Seth and Enosh and Canaan and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch and Methuselah, the oldest man who ever lived, 969 years at the end of his little timeline there, Lamech, and then, of course, Noah and Shem and Arphaxad, all the way down to, Joseph down there at the bottom. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So anyway, when you add all that up to the flood, from Adam up to the flood, it's 1,656 years from the creation of Adam. That's a lot shorter than the millions of years. And not by some chance random event, right? Which results in a worldview that basically teaches, think about this, human life doesn't have any meaning or purpose. Everything happened by accident. You can't get purpose out of an accident. Rather, from the actions of an intelligent, purposeful, and personal designer, creator God. Through that, our lives do have meaning because He has personally placed us here for His purposes. And we have an instinct that tells us life needs to mean something. If your life isn't going anywhere, not meaning anything, you are depressed. It's great to know who God is and that He's got a purpose for you. Moving right along. The great geological catastrophic flood event all began on a single day. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. That's the end date on that 1,656 years, the 600th year of Noah's life, and even down to the month and day. On that same day, all of that water came gushing up from underneath the earth, and the windows of heaven in tremendous downpouring was coming onto the surface of the earth. Dr. Brown's Hydroplate Theory is described through a series of phases, and what we see portrayed here is called the rupture phase, the initiation of this event, the time when it reaches a crisis point and something dramatic and powerful happens. It's a waterfall in reverse all the way around the globe. As I said a few moments ago, bear in mind that the water contained in those subterranean chambers was highly pressurized from the weight of all that granite firmament pressing down upon it due to gravity. Now we must ask, is there some sort of mechanism that resulted in the crust rupturing and then releasing all that pressurized water? Let's talk about that pressurized water first to get an idea. This is where we start getting into some new stuff now. Most of us are aware that the moon causes the tides on the earth. This diagram, of course, is extreme in its dimensions there, stretching everything out in order to make the point. The gravitational pull of the moon lifts the ocean waters. I imagine that blue is actually the atmosphere, and the atmosphere would be affected too. Gravity affects everything to some extent or other. And the ground would be affected by that as well. The gravitational pull of the moon lifts the waters, the ocean waters, and other waters as well, pulling them up and thus tugging the water edges along the shores away from the land. And as the moon moves around the earth, it releases its tug in one area as its tug increases in the next area. That gravitational pull. Areas pulled most greatly by the moon are in high tide. Areas most fully released from the moon's pull are said to be in low tide. Of course, this means that on the pre-flood Earth, the gravitational pull of the moon would also have impacted the water in the subterranean chambers, as well as those pillars and the chambers themselves. Of course, if it's moving the pillars, it's going to affect them. It's going to draw on them. Some chambers in high tide, other chambers would be in low tide. And bear in mind that these chambers are all interconnected, and the water is a fluid. This is going to result in a condition that is known as tidal pumping, Tidal pumping. And it's just what it sounds like. The already highly pressurized water in those interconnected chambers would be impacted by a pumping action caused by the gravitational tug and release of the moon as it is moving and as the Earth is turning. Tidal pumping. Dr. Brown describes it this way. Tides in the subterranean water lifted the massive crust twice daily. At low tides, the crust settled, compressing, the weight coming down now, heating the pillars. So temperatures in the subterranean chambers steadily rose, generating a fraction of today's geothermal heat. And he explains later on that the geothermal heat is caused by things that happen after the flood, or as a result of the flood, and the geothermal heating picks up from that. But anyhow, some minerals then dissolved in this high-pressure liquid water, limestone, salt, and quartz. So in those chambers, minerals are dissolving. In a few chapters, you will see why, after the flood, this dissolved quartz petrified some wood and cemented flood sediments into sedimentary rocks. Now notice there's lots of energy, there's lots of movement here going on with all this, with the moon moving overhead, drawing things up from the earth and under the earth as well, and causing this effect of moving this water, and heat and pressure is increasing and so forth. Dr. Brown says that the tides in the subterranean water would lift the massive crust twice a day. By the way, that granite crust of the pre-flood earth, according to Dr. Brown's theory, was about 60 miles thick. That's a lot of granite, and that's a lot of weight. Low tides settled the crust down onto those pillars, causing them to heat up. This, in turn, would heat up the water in the chambers. With heat and pressure, the water moving, the water became highly solvent, allowing minerals like limestone, salt, and quartz to dissolve easily in that water. Basically, we are now cooking mineral water all over and inside the planet. So, the 60-mile thick crust would be distorted and worked by the moon's gravity. Gravity is the factor in so much of this. Obviously, it wouldn't have moved as much as the water, this crust in the open sea, by the gravitational pull of the moon, but still it would move, and it still would contort the Earth into a slight egg shape. Now, the deformation in this graphic, of course, again, is exaggerated to make the point, to show you. And on this next graphic, you'll see only 4 of the subterranean pillars, when the reality would have been thousands of pillars, where these depressions settled in on the surface and different water pillars of different sizes and shapes and everything else all over, thousands of them. And of course you can see Mike Lindell with 4 pillars of his own. He probably has thousands of pillars, but he doesn't have my pillar. That's back on my bed. Thanks, Mike. Well, let's push on without Mike now. Goodbye. The 4 pillars are brown. Okay, and you can also see, therefore, 4 subterranean water-filled chambers, and the water is a light blue. Of course, the moon's tidal pull is also moving the pillars in the chambers, right? And as the Earth rotates on its axis, and the moon revolves around the Earth, the tidal impact happens all over the Earth. Like the tides on the shore, twice a day, the shell would have deformed and then rested, pumping the waters of the great deep continually throughout the subterranean chambers at a very high pressure. It's really all simple physics, totally attributable to the engine being run by gravity, the moon. And you'll see in this graphic that the pillars are getting redder. Notice the color change. They're heating up from all of this tidal pumping activity. Pressure and then tension. Pressure, the weight, and then tension pulling them up. Pressure from the weight, tension pulling up. A continuous tidal cycle. To illustrate how this motion heated the pillars, open up a paper clip and then bend it back and forth in the same spot, back and forth several times. And then press that same spot, that bend of the paper clip against your cheek, and feel how warm it has gotten. That's heat being transferred by the energy you're applying by bending the material back and forth. Now then, think about how much more heat would be generated in that massive, millions of tons, if not billions of tons of massive granite shell, while it is moving with so much greater energy from all this gravitational pull. You can see that the water-filled chambers have also changed color to represent the water inside is heating up. And as water heats, it expands, right? And there's pressure starting to build, just like a pressure cooker. As tidal pumping continued, the temperature and pressure within the subterranean chambers increased. Now this next graphic shows a phase diagram for water. You can see the three different phases or states of water. Of H2O, you've got ice, and then you've got liquid water, and there's water vapor down in the lower almost 1/3 or more of the graph. And then there's also, in that red zone, a very unique state called supercritical water, or SCW. We'll talk more about SCW, or supercritical water, a little later on. Now you can see pressure in pounds per square inch is measured on the vertical axis there, the up and down axis, right? And temperature along the horizontal axis at the bottom is measured in degrees Fahrenheit. Look at the top there. You have a dotted line going across 372,000 pounds per square inch. Not going to get that in your tire, all right? The 372,000 psi represents the pressure upon the subterranean water that comes from the weight of the 60 miles thick granite crust pressing down on it. At the average sea level pressure of 14.7 psi, which is further down than on the graph there, 14.7 pounds per square inch shown on the graph, water at 32 degrees Fahrenheit is changed into a solid. All right, that's when it freezes. This point is measured by a yellow circle on the graph there. You can sort of follow the dotted lines out to the psi and then down to the 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you follow the solid black line to the right of that yellow circle, you'll travel across the liquid water state, the blue field there, until you encounter the boundary between liquid and gas, or water and vapor. I've marked it with an orange arrow pointing upward. Again, at the sea level pressure of 14.7 psi, at this point, the water temperature is now 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The water is boiling and it's turning into a gas. That water vapor would dissipate into the open if it had a place to go. But see, in these underground chambers, which are filled with water, there is no place for the gas to go. The pressure is intense, and the temperature is increasing, and the water is moving at 705 degrees Fahrenheit and 3200 psi. The boiling water reaches what is called the critical point. And when the temperature and pressure pass that critical point, this changes everything. This contained water, remember it's contained, the gas can't escape, okay? It's contained underneath that 60-mile thick crust of granite above it. The water enters into a state called supercritical. When water is supercritical, it cannot boil. It doesn't boil away. There's no place for the gas to go. There's no place for the vapor to dissipate. The centuries, just think about this now, the centuries of this tidal pumping led to the subterranean water exceeding that critical temperature of 705 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Brown explains a little bit. As the temperature continued to increase, the pressure grew. The crust stretched, all right? And the energy from the tidal pumping increasingly ionized the water. Molecules are breaking down and particles and electrons, protons are being kicked out and they're becoming charged particles. All right, the atoms left are taking on charges, and so that's ionization of the water. There's electrical energy in there. Hot liquids cool primarily by evaporation from their surfaces, okay? If you have a lot of surface, you're going to lose a lot of heat quickly. SCW, or supercritical water, consists of microscopic liquid droplets dispersed within water vapor. The rate at which most hot objects cool off depends on their total surface area. The smaller a particle, the larger its surface area is relative to its volume, so more of its heat can be quickly transferred to its surroundings. That water vapor is going to, or that liquid water is going to lose heat quickly. The liquid I've got to change slides here, sorry. The liquid in supercritical water has an area to volume ratio that is 1 trillion times greater than that of the regular water, the flood water that covered the Earth's surface. Consequently, the liquid in SCW, or supercritical water, cools almost instantly if its pressure drops. This is because the myriad of shimmering liquid droplets, each surrounded by vapor, can simultaneously evaporate. They all go at once. These droplets break up and reform continuously. It's a constant back and forth in this state of thing. It's water, it's vapor, it's back to water again, from liquid to vapor, and constantly changing. And you have liquid and vapor simultaneously there. It's a lot of verbiage in that description, but what Dr. Brown is describing is an extremely high energy situation. Let's enter into this with some theological understanding about what might be causing this. Over time, since the fall of man and the curse upon the ground and the rest of the natural order, everything in creation under man's dominion begins to break down and die. I'm convinced that this alteration in the physical universe brought by human rebellion against the Creator is what led to the circumstances we've been discussing here tonight that starts to throw off the machinery of the earth and the moon and throwing it out of whack. Colossians chapter 1, speaking of Jesus Christ and his acts of creation as the Creator, says this: "For by him all things were created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, or on earth." That's Genesis chapter 1 right there. Visible things and invisible. So we have the heavenly realm and the beings that occupy that we can't see, and of course the things we can, the visible on the earthly realm. So 2 realms, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. And all of those are on earth, and all of those likewise are in the heavenly, both good and evil principalities and powers. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist. According to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the Greek word translated consist there, synestemi, has the sense of putting together with the nuances or the variances of definition as A, to be composed of, B, to exist or to be, C, to associate, D, to commend, and E, to display. So those are variant nuances of meaning of this word for consist. The dictionary says further, significant theologically is the statement in Colossians 1:17 that Christ is before all things and all things consist or have their existence in him. He's the one that has brought all things into existence, and they exist because they are in him. It's like he's holding everything together. Right before it says that, in this dictionary, it references another verse, 2 Peter 3:5, and I want to look at that with you. It says this. Let's back up here. Not that it matters too much. "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth," again, that's Genesis 1:1, "and the earth," notice this, "standing out of water and in the water." Now, the Greek word for standing here is the very same word translated as consist in Colossians 1:17, synestemi. All passages, or both passages, are referring to the creation of all things at the very beginning of creation, right? And Peter focuses on exactly the subject that we've been hashing through this evening. The earth in relation to the water. Water above the earth, water beneath the earth. Notice the water is mentioned twice here. It's not hard for me to say it like so. The earth, that granite firmament, exists out of the water, beneath it, and at the same time exists in the water above it. It is that Oreo cookie. I can't get any of these slides right here. It's that Oreo cookie analogy again, where the earth is the cream filling sandwiched between the chocolate water cookies. Peter's talking about the same thing, out of the water and in the water. By the power of Christ, this is the way things consisted at the very beginning. And when man sinned, the relationship between the Creator and his creation suffered damage. There was of necessity a distancing between, not a social distancing, but a hamartiological distancing, a sinful distancing between the creation, the now corrupted creation and cursed creation, and the holy and righteous and just Creator. A separation, and the cookie began to crumble. It is almost as though Christ the Creator, in a sense, released his grip on his created order. Things are not going to consist or exist as well as they were before, when he was holding it much more closely. It's just an analogy. It's not the serious way of it, but it shows between these two. He's holding it, it's consisting, and then it's not going to hold together as well, because he must step away from the cursed thing. This led to the impact of that curse, the whole creation groaning, as it were, and everything began to die. Everything began to break down and fall apart. And this is exactly what is happening to that subterranean water system that God originally created. Over the centuries following the fall of man, this tidal pumping we talked about is adding energy to that water as things are running out of whack. It's like we're not firing on all cylinders in this machine anymore. It increases the temperature. It increases the pressure on the crust, swelling outward, and the subterranean pillar system is heating up and having to deal with this additional pressure. The supercritical water that this creates, with its extreme pressure and temperature, begins to expand ever more rapidly, and this thing just increases like exponentially. The crust, therefore, expands from within the earth, just like an inflating balloon, and eventually the shell of the earth fails at the weakest point. Dr. Brown says, as the flood began, supercritical water jetted up through a globe encircling rupture in the crust, as from a ruptured pressure cooker. This huge acceleration expanded the spacing between water molecules, allowing flash evaporation, sudden cooling, and even greater expansion, acceleration, and cooling. Therefore, most of the vast thermal, electrical, chemical, and surface energy in the subterranean water ended up not as heat at the Earth's surface, but as extreme kinetic or motion energy in all the fountains of the great deep. As you will see, these velocities were high enough to launch material into outer space, the final dumping ground for most of the energy in the supercritical water. The system failed in a huge, high-pressure explosion across the surface. The crust broke apart, and the water came rushing up at supersonic speed, high pressure, extremely hot, And the pieces began to spread away from each other on the surface of that granite crust as it broke apart. Millions of tons of supercritical water burst high into the atmosphere, carrying debris from that crust out beyond the grip of Earth's gravity. Much water began to fall back to Earth over all the globe in torrents of water as the windows of heaven were opened. As soon as humans initially sinned against God, everything was set into motion. And barring any divine intervention, the impending global catastrophe was inevitable. Sin is a terrible thing. Rebellion is a terrible thing. And I think that's what we see happening here with all of this activity. Again, this is a theory. It's not firm that this is the way it was, but it certainly has a lot of explanatory power for what we see today. As we move ahead, we'll enter into talking about other phases of this whole process. This is just the initiation, the initial explosion, as I said, the immediate crisis that resulted in this fracture on the planet. And we'll see as we've seen already before in some of the pictures I've shown of the underground or undersea, beneath the seas, that mid-oceanic ridge that exists all over the planet, following that crack that you see on that diagram and illustration there. The impending global catastrophe coming as a result of that, moving the continents away at great speeds from each other, forming the Atlantic Ocean, and then things sinking in on the other side. The Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ocean, as all of that dropped, as things moved over here and the weight shifted upward, it caused kind of a subduction or whatever on the other side, just pulling things in. And that's why we have this Ring of Fire around the Pacific Rim, because of that action. But so many things in this that we have yet to look at. I hope that you are enjoying this, at least at some level. There'll be a test on all of this next week. Of course, I'm kidding. It's a lot of information. The point is, what we have here is a way of explaining things apart from what we've been taught in school about millions of years. And we've seen the deficits time and again of this millions of years explanation. Tonight, it was in the granite itself, testifies against that molten surface for millions of years. It just couldn't have been. We'd see something different than what we see today if that were the case. So I hope this encourages you in understanding what the Bible says and how we can trust it as the Word of God, because He was there, He did observe, and He's describing to us what happened. God bless you, folks. Take care. Have a wonderful week. We'll be with you again next week, Lord willing.